Hi, everybody. Good evening, and welcome to Diao Artists and Artists Lecture Series. My name is Jasmine Raymond. I am the curator here at Diao, and it's a pleasure to see all of you. I hope that at some point everybody gets a seat. I think there's people around helping, so please bear with us. We knew it was going to be packed, but we didn't expect this blockbuster. So we need a bigger space. Maybe we punch behind this wall. 2013 is a special year here at Diao, as we prepare to celebrate two anniversaries, the 30-year anniversary of the Dan Flavin Art Institute in Bridgehampton, and the 10th year anniversary at Diao Beacon, the presentation of Diao's collection upstate at Diao Beacon. Please keep an eye out for our calendar and our newsletters, as we're planning different programs to celebrate both anniversaries. Tonight's program, as many of you know, aimed to go inside both the mind and the heart of our guest artists. The premise is to interrogate, explore, perhaps commemorate, or even respond to the work or practice of an artist from Diao's collection. The series is supported in part by the public funds of the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, and we also like to thank Brooklyn Brewery for the complimentary drinks that you have tonight. And I also would like to thank my colleagues and the Diao staff who helped coordinate this program. But more importantly, I also want to thank enormous gratitude to David Diao for taking this invitation to be part of the series tonight, and for choosing to speak of Barnett Newman's past with Diao. Barnett Newman had a few shows, including two shows. One at Wooster Street, at the former exhibition space that Diao used to have in Soho. The first one was Barnett Newman for paintings from 1952 to 68. Held in 1982 through March of 1984, which was then immediately followed by Barnett Newman, 3 paintings held from March 1984 to March 1985. David Diao was born in 1943 in Chengdu, Sichuan, China, and at the age of 6, on the eve of October 1st, 1949, his parents sent him to Hong Kong to live with his grandparents. 6 years later, at the age of 12, he arrived to the United States to join his father. Diao first gained attention with his solo show at Paula Cooper in 1969. A 2-person show followed the same year at the Ocastelli Gallery in New York with Peter Young, and at Carmen Lamanna Gallery in Toronto with Bryce Marden. Since then, Diao's work has been exhibited internationally and can be found in numerous collections, including the Albright Knox Art Gallery, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Art Gallery of Ontario, the Museum of Modern Art of Saint-Étienne in France. And in 2011, he had also a solo show titled David Diao's Dan Henley House. I lived there until I was 6, which was presented at Galeria Maria Cervera in Madrid. More recently, last fall, Diao mounted a 2-person solo show with Wally Rad, who's here with us tonight, at Paula Cooper. And his work was also included in the 20th anniversary presentation of Conceptual Abstraction at Hunter College, where alongside early works of Diao, he presented an updated version of Barnett Newman's Chronology of Work from 2010. Painting involves scrutinizing a subject, being both intimate and distant, both persuasive and detached. In Diao's work, there are personal registers and private anecdotes, but also an identification with other artists, his own private homages that transform images into commemorations for what he appropriates is first and foremost personally applicable, suitable for him, and intimate to him. Here tonight, we're privileged to hear him share with us the principle of his own practice through his enduring attention of Newman's work. Thank you.
Thank you, Yasmine. It's quite an honor to be invited by Diao to come and participate in this series. So I thank you. And before that, I would like to thank several people. Heidi Klausmann-Freiberger from the Barnett Newman Foundation, who opened the archives to me. And moreover, I would like to, for the first time, publicly acknowledge my grateful thanks to Magda Sawang and Tomasz Banakov, who have given me a home since they opened their gallery in 1985 and allow me a place to present my work every few years. Thank you both. And it's really heartening to see this very filled room. I, of course, acknowledge that as your love for Barnett Newman. So I hope I won't disappoint you. Basically, as I was preparing for this talk, what loomed in front of me was that I did not, well, first off, it's definitely going to be TMI, so just hold on to your seats. But basically, I would just like to keep in mind that it's not going to be pure hagiography for Barnett Newman, nor just advertisements for myself. So bearing those in mind, those 2 points in mind, let's begin. This is a picture of Barnett Newman in front of his studio on Front Street. I love this image because it shows him in his absolute kind of confidence as a man of the world, as a painter, as a thinker, and as someone who just didn't take any shit from anybody. And of course, very early on, I do want to propose to you my involvement with this person and his work. Here is an image of him and an unnamed person standing in front of his famous cathedral, and me standing in front of one of my paintings. It's very clear in this photo, this particular photo of him is at his request after he saw the photo of Paul Feely up at Bennington in front, very close up to one of his paintings. And it basically evidenced what he wanted people to do, which is to be very close to his paintings, not to be seeing it from a great distance, but to be actually right there. And basically, I could go on for just a few minutes, if I may, about the fact of him being a real New Yorker, born and bred in New York, the beneficiary of the great idea of public education, as in the City University of New York, something we might not be having at the moment. But he was basically very smart and took advantage of the education that was available for immigrant people at that time. He was very early on a very argumentative person in the social world. But for many years, he was not so happy with his own work. So frankly, there's no work of his that predates 1944 that he would accept on his own. He basically destroyed everything. But he did take on the job of articulating for himself what it was to embark on a life of being an artist and to make that life in some way count. One of his chief texts that has come to, in many ways, represent him for many people, well, he wrote quite a few texts for The Tiger's Eye, which was a small journal published around 1946 to 1949. In the 49 winter issue, he published his very famous essay, The Sublime is Now, where he basically said, well, he wasn't interested in beauty. You know, he was interested in something more exalted than that. And that sublime was not going to come from the natural world, but it was going to come out of the artist. It's a very, highfalutin stance for an artist that many of us, can marvel at, but hardly dare to try to parallel. In any case, one could also say that his particular intelligence and stick-to-itiveness in attempting to put down in words his thoughts at a moment when he wasn't able to feel that he could do much with his painting, in the end, as you will see, came to haunt him, in that people came to take him only as a writer and not as a painter. And this was the eternal struggle he had for most of his life. He basically only had 6 shows during his lifetime. The first 2 in 1950 and 51 at Betty Parsons, who he had met through Adolf Gottlieb and perhaps Rothko. And he helped her actually to form the stable of her gallery, creating group shows and specific theme shows on primitive art and so forth, and writing brilliant texts for these. I mean, not your standard potboiler texts, but ones that are like unexpected and mode breaking. So for his first show in 1950, most of the art world at the time was anxiously awaiting it. And they came and basically discounted it. They didn't think it was painting. They actually thought this was a joke. They actually thought this person had no talent. Barney is a great writer, but he can't paint. Barney is a hoax, in a sense, to such a degree that it's not so named, but if you read the various texts, you realize it was Motherwell himself who said, "I thought you were one of us, but in fact, you're out just to make fun of us." And you have to think also that in 1950, the paradigm for painting already somehow has been established by the painterly wing of abstract expressionism. People specifically embodied in, say, William de Kooning and Franz Klein. And for them, it's the flourish of the brush, at the end of which was the expression, at the end of which was what a painter does. Whereas Newman's kind of very flat-footed, dry, very kind of direct approach just seemed not to be art-worthy. In any case, it caused him a great amount of pain. And the second show he had a year later didn't do much better. In fact, the second show, people didn't even come. The first show, they were curious because finally the writer is having his first show. The second one, they knew he was already what he had done, and basically stayed away. And it was very disheartening to him. And after some short months, he actually withdrew his work from the gallery and embarked on several years of doing nothing. Well, I like to refer to these years as his gap years, because it's not as if he wasn't working. The idea is, in fact, he was probably thinking more than ever how to proceed. And it's something that I think every working artist encounters at multiple points in their career. I mean, it is not from the outside where the work develops, nicely, linearly, ever upward. In fact, it's always like stops and gaps. And certainly in Newman's life and work, he exemplified that. And the basically he not only was rejected by people he wanted to have respect him, but also at some point he got a heart attack in 1957 and was basically out of commission for quite some time. And the other thing is the people he respected besides the artists. I mean, obviously it was very painful for him to have de Koonings and Franz Kleins and Motherwells and Reinhardts and who have you put him down. But he was also denigrated by the critics. The important critics of the time obviously were Rosenberg and Greenberg. They both were quite negative about his work. It wasn't until something like 1963 before Rosenberg wrote something very deep, very positive about him. And Greenberg had only in 1952 said, oh, everyone's putting this work down, so there must be something good about it. And then didn't write about it in any positive way until 1955 in his American style painting. But then Greenberg made the great mistake of making it seem as if Newman had been an acolyte of Clyfford Still, which this will be a thread that will run through this talk, is Newman did not take this lying down. He immediately wrote a letter to Greenberg laying out the fact that he couldn't have been a student or an acolyte of Clyfford Stills. Anyway, by then, Greenberg had come around thinking that Newman was up to something and was responsible in helping him do the show up at Bennington. Officially invited by E.C. Goosen, the curator who later on did the Art of the Real. And it was at a moment when, basically it came out of nowhere, and Newman got to inaugurate the new gallery up there and get to show a whole bunch of his paintings. And then very shortly thereafter, Greenberg curated a show for him at French and Company, which is an old, gallery that had a long history of selling everything from antiques to art. They started a modern wing, and Greenberg was the first to be the curator. And this got Newman a certain amount of attention, and people began to look at his work, in a more positive way. And then shortly after that, in 1962, Alan Stone, that very maverick dealer of various things, did a very interesting show where he basically posed Newman against the other so-called titan of the abstract expressionists, the more lyrical wing, which is to say, Willem de Kooning. And then, after that, there was the Stations of the Cross. Now that's actually a very interesting story. The Stations of the Cross, he started making around the time he had his heart attack. The first two of them were painted in his apartment in Brooklyn Heights. But then it was the great luck of having Lawrence Alloway, who happened to visit the show up at Bennington with Betty Parsons, and he saw a lot in this work, visited Newman, and almost immediately offered to do a big show at the Guggenheim Museum, where he was just hired as the new curator. And the last show he had in his lifetime was at Knoedler in 1969. That is also a show I happen to have seen. The Guggenheim show of the Stations of the Cross, maybe you have read on the handout. I was lucky enough to actually have helped to hang, and it was where I first met Barnett Newman. But in any case, the show in 1969 at Nerdler was the one where it's written about in all the books that the young, important artists in the New York art world came to embrace Newman's work. And we're now talking about Frank Stella, Jasper Johns, Donald Judd. Already in 1965, I could go back a little, Newman was invited by Walter Hobbs to lead a delegation of American artists to represent us at the Sao Paulo Biennale. And initially it was presented to Newman that he would be the father figure, which in his typical fashion, he did not want to be. But then he did go as the elder statesman in some way at the head of a delegation which included several artists from the West Coast, people like Larry Bell, I can't even remember, the ones I remember are the New York ones, Judd, Larry Poons, and Frank Stella. And well, anyway, I might even have forgotten a couple of those. But in any case, that's when I think Newman's reputation began to really soar, when young artists began to see value in what he was doing. And knowing that history, it's every old artist's hope that young artists would, maybe look at you. So anyway, I'm somewhat of a bibliophile, as those of you who know me would know. Here's a small collection of works of mine on Barnett Newman. I'd like to point out that in his lifetime, if you stacked up all the books written about him, it would amount to less than an inch. So in fact, maybe this is an example of what he meant when he said, the big struggle in modern art is to be against the catalog. It's very cryptic. I don't know what that really means. Maybe it means he didn't like photography. He preferred the work in reality. This is the only painting that is still in the collection of Diao. It's from 1946. It's Genesis. It's called Genesis, the Break. And it's somewhat typical of work of his before 1948, where a lot of the imagery alluded to notions of regeneration, notions of genesis, of growth, of creation. From chaos, God created earth, or something to that effect. And it's clearly that it's influenced by a kind of surrealism that was afoot at the time. And they weren't very big. They weren't very big at all. But then, on his birthday, in January of 1948, he made this painting. What's amazing is every monograph, every major study, every study of any length about Newman always refers to this painting as his breakthrough painting. What's amazing about it is in continuing to do a certain kind of work he was doing with a kind of atmospheric background with various almost playful, maybe not playful, but at least variegated background, there would be some linear elements. Anyway, in this case, he planned, after painting the dark red ground, he placed a masking tape down smack the middle of it. And to test the color, he smudged some cadmium red light on top of the tape. Somehow, he did not rip the tape off and fill in the area with the color he had chosen. But instead, he looked at this painting for about 8 months. And he realized there was something there. That in fact, what he was doing was beyond the atmospheric kind of field-like atmosphere, in some way alluding back to nature. That there was something amazingly right there about this painting. And he kept it. And it's called Wonment Number 1. Because he then went on to do like several bigger versions of Wonment, up to Wonment 6. And curiously enough, this painting, which everyone thinks is so important, as I do as well, he did not show in the next the few very first shows that he had. It did not appear on the wall until Bennington. This is something I just discovered. It was amazing. If the painting was that important to you, wouldn't you want to feature it? Yet he held it back. And the other interesting thing about his work is he had very few shows, but he was very astute in the presentation of each body of work. Each show will usually have new work plus work he had already shown. So in a way, it's not like, oh, I'm doing a new show, it's all brand new work. And for me, this points to his sense of community. He basically wanted to bring his audience along by giving them real examples of where he had come to where he is now, and hopefully will give them the interest to know where he might be going. But it's always this kind of, it's never just this to this to this. It's always like part of the old gets brought ahead, and then part of the second brought to the third, and so forth. This to me is a really interesting idea. And he did this Wonment. It's a very small painting, by the way. And it was in the collection of Annalie most of their lives. And as was the custom for him, he would give her a painting on her birthday every year. And this is to acknowledge that she basically, with her poetry, shorthand teachers in public school salary, kept the two of them alive. And she has famously said, "Oh, it was never a question of my own career. We were in this together. I just wanted to lighten my husband's load and help him in his work." It's enough to bring tears to your eyes. So having done Wonment and stared at it for 8 months, he wanted to try it out to see if by doing 2 pieces of tape that the same meaning could obtain. So there it is with 2 pieces of masking tape and some painting on top. As I guess I just wasn't advanced enough to really get the more linear, flatly painted Newmans. For many years, this was my favorite Newman because it's so much more residually painterly, if you will. Showing this, I actually picked a few slides of works of his that I thought everyone would be able to go tomorrow to see. This one is in the Metropolitan Museum. Wonment was in the Abstract Expressionism show, but in fact it's not on view, as I discovered going to MoMA last week to have one last look at the Newmans. And in fact, there are only 2 Newmans on view. One is Via Heroicus Sublimis, and the other is The Voice, an amazing all-white painting done in egg tempera. I mean, people tend to think, oh, it's just a line or 2, but in fact, the range of materials that he worked with and the ways he worked with them is really remarkable. But anyway, this one is available for view. And actually, I would like to have the pleasure of showing you something. That's Gary Stefford, a painter from Maine. He got this brush from Harvey Quaitman. Harvey was my neighbor on the Bowery and the father of Rebecca Quaitman. In any case, you can still see some of the green paint from Concord in this brush. What we might not know is Newman's particular relationship to the materials of his craft, his trade, his being an artist. He would brush, well, there are so many ways of getting at it. He would stretch the canvas several times, sizing it each time, taking it away, re-stretch it to make it tighter. When he used the brush, he would spend an hour washing it out at the end of the day. And the brushes would be hanging either with rubber bands on the ladders or scaffolding, or if they have hose, a nail on the wall, but always hanging with the brush down. And I value this a lot because, it's something that I do as well. It's not fetishism. It's a kind of respect for one's tools. Thank you. And of course, one has to show this painting. This is called Via Heroicus Sublimis. It's about 18 feet wide. And there it is, sonorously present in MoMA. You can go there tomorrow and look at it. And what's really amazing is that it is really an example of what he meant when he wasn't meaning to just make big painting for the sake of big. He did it for the sake of scale. And also it really exemplified his idea of the intimacy of the relationship of the viewer to the painting. Because when you go up to it and your peripheral vision is such that you do not see the ends of the painting, and as you scale across the work, the various zips, what he referred to, he called those lines zips, became a kind of beat. And he also worked on this a long time. He basically did it in 1950, and just before his 1951 show at Betty Parsons, he changed that one band, that ivory one, and made it just a little bit thicker in paint. Mel Bachner has mentioned how when watching people looking at this painting, he was aware of the cast of red glow on the people's faces. And that's something that possibly Newman was interested in. But anyway. Yeah, I would like to, well, actually, it would not be wrong to say pay homage to this person, Lawrence Alloway. An incredibly unsung voice, a critical voice in New York, and certainly during my early years. As I said before, he had been responsible in bringing the Stations of the Cross to the Guggenheim Museum. Basically at a moment when, Newman was beginning to gain respect, but not to the passionate degree to which Alloway brought it. And for me, what's important was I was able to sit in on his graduate seminar class at NYU. And much of my formation, I think I have to say, was informed by his critical voice. So it was particularly tonic to recently be able to have in my hands a selection of his essays edited by Richard Kalina. I say you should all buy this book. And the range is quite remarkable. He was the guy who, while still in England, worked with the This Is Tomorrow group, the people who wanted to revel in the post-war upbeat of everything and the changes in culture in England when it was still rather bleak in the late 40s and early 50s. He worked very closely with people like the Smithsons, the architects, Rainer Bainum, the very important architectural historian, and so forth. He, in fact, he came up with the term pop art. And to my knowledge, he's one of the first people to kind of mix the high and the low. He was very interested in science fiction. He was also very interested in cartoons and so forth. Well, in any case, for me, he was very important because he talked above anything else that one of the great achievements of the first generation, which is to say Newman, Still, and Rothko, maybe Reinhardt, was the idea of holism, which maybe later on got corrupted to mean field painting. But in fact, what he was thinking about is just the notion that you approach things complete, not by breaking it up into parts. And I'm not sure I see this word holism much else, anywhere else, but he certainly reiterated this term, and it got stuck in my head. And also his great before that essay, his essay about de Kooning, how de Kooning's work came to represent what painting is. And he pointed very accurately to the writing of Rosenberg and Thomas Hess, who both had the advantage of being in the studio. So basically, they repeated what de Kooning told them. That's the implication. But how those from the horse's mouth notion of art criticism came to stand for what painting was in America for a very long time. But more so, his very important essay on the American sublime, which was very important to me and I'm sure to many other people, which basically talked about the work of Newman again, and Still, and Rothko, and Pollock, avoiding the topological fallacy of saying, well, it's from the great open land of America, but, putting it through the historical sieve of more people like Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke was great when it came to talking about the sublime. He just happened to have been a horrible conservative critic, but so we take him in parts. This was very important to my formation, that particular essay. It was about the same time, I would say, as Susan Sontag's essay on the aesthetics of silence, which wrote a lot more about Reinhardt, but it was an appeal to the same notion of emptiness as something, unexpressible and beyond imaging. But then Alloway was also the curator at the Guggenheim. Oh, by the way, I couldn't find my old copy of Living Arts, the English magazine with the American Sublime. It's buried somewhere. But I came across this from my files, a wonderful essay in Art International by Alloway, which actually gave me all the information of how Newman would show the same work again in a subsequent show as a way of bringing the viewer present to the present. In any case, Alloway was the chief curator at the Guggenheim, and I was able to help hang Newman's show. It was very lucky. I wasn't on full staff, but I think it was, my first job in New York was working at Sam Coote's gallery, which was a fairly important gallery of its time. And I was just the guy who, did the vacuuming, basically. Didn't have to sell art. But then the main artist of that gallery, Hans Hofmann, died, and Coutts had intended to close the gallery, only keeping it open until the passing of Hans Hofmann. So after that, I was rather free, and my friend Jeff Way had a full-time job at the Guggenheim. So whenever they had shows, they needed extra help, and I would be hired to work there. And I could also say just a little about the culture of the Guggenheim at the time. Now we know Guggenheim as global, in Bilbao, where have you. At the time, 1966, the Guggenheim was like a small family museum. The building itself had just opened in 1959, and Alloway had been hired to be the very young chief curator. There was a woman named Svensson who dealt with the collection. There was a young curator who I also liked very much named Daniel Robbins, who actually then went on to the RISD Museum and bought some work of mine for the RISD Museum. But what's interesting is I want to focus on the small, kind of tight-knit family quality of the museum. There was Orrin Riley and Saul Fierstein, who ran the conservation department and the preparators, the people who help hang the shows. And very interestingly, they actually gave a studio to an artist who had known, the woman who was running the place, whose name I now forget. The painter's name was Zerkson or something like that. And he was a kind of, would be related to, say, American Abstract Artists Association people, between Mondrian and so forth. And then Paul Katz was the photographer, and there was a painter named Ward Jackson, who was the archivist. And Ward Jackson, many of you may have known, was a very good painter who said if he hadn't the job at the Guggenheim, he wouldn't have been able to survive. And anyway, his work is still available somewhere. But anyway, I got to work on the Stations of the Cross, which was started by Newman right around 1958, right after one small painting that was the first painting he did after the heart attack. And this was done in a small apartment on Pierpont Street in Brooklyn Heights. I went to visit the building last week, but it was all enshrouded in scaffolding, and the picture I took didn't really show anything. It's a big, tall building. So anyway, you have to imagine. So the first two Stations of the Cross were stretched in the apartment, and they were basically just black paint on raw canvas. When he started it, he had no idea it was going to stretch into a series of 14 paintings. But somehow, in the course of about 8 years, it became the series. And again, I have to give the credit rather than lay the blame, give the credit to Alloway for the support that he rendered, which gave, I think, Newman the kind of encouragement to actually continue the series. Well, in any case, we first hung the 14 stations in what is called the high gallery of the Guggenheim. It is that tall gallery right up the first ramp. And I wasn't in the decision maker's position, obviously, but it came to be thought that that was too tight. So we actually took them all out and hung the first 4 stations along the ramp just before the high gallery. And then the coda to the 14 Stations of the Cross was a painting called Be Now, which happens to be mostly white with just one red line and one black line. As often is the case, I think that painting was shown in some other show by itself, but in this case, it functioned as the kind of end note to this series. And what it did is, I think, instead of being surrounded by the work, it became actually how Stations of the Crosses are encountered in churches. You go from station to station, there's a kind of pilgrimage or a linearity or ambulatory movement. I had a chance to debate Nan Rosenthal on this subject. Now, Nan Rosenthal became the curator at the National Gallery, which was able at some point to acquire the entire series. And what she did was she hung the 14 Stations of the Cross basically around the place that had been constructed for David Smith's Spoleto series, which, if you would remember, was like an amphitheater. So basically, the paintings were installed in the round. And my argument against it was, this is very much against Newman's notion of approaching the painting in a very intimate way. That in fact, many a viewer could easily go to the center of the circle, cast his or her gaze around, and thereby think that they've seen the entire 14 paintings. And also I said to her that I thought she had too much in her mind the example of Rothko's chapel. And anyway, she did not deny any of these charges. And we're still friends. One interesting thing about Nan is she got to benefit, I'm sure not the only one, who after Newman's death, Annalie finally had some money because they were so impecunious most of their lives. She would travel and stay in fancy hotels, but would bring a friend with her. And Nan, as she told me, was the beneficiary of some of these trips. Well, anyway, the amazing thing about this group is with such economy of means, he's able to establish a series that gives you a kind of a system of similarity of difference. It's just, I could almost say that this is amongst my favorites of his works, even though I have to say I love those red, yellow, blue ones as well. This one, the one on the far left, is just amazing. It's the only one that has the brush marks like horizontally splayed into the white field. And when you look at the group, the white is so different, especially when the white of the canvas is worked on with areas with actual white paint. So from white canvas standing in for pure white, suddenly the pure white is no longer pure white. It's just remarkable. Two of the paintings in the Stations of the Cross have this very peculiar stretcher in these very large diagonal supports. And I'm showing it because I myself, in 1967-8, was given two of these stretchers, built this very same way, though much larger, by Ron Gorchov. And I made some paintings on them. And maybe this is one of the first instances where I ran into the trouble of, as I'm painting, the stretcher bars came through. And in this case, the huge diagonals of the stretcher bars allowed me to see it no longer just as an impediment and a drawback from painting on stretched canvas with the bars nearby. side to be hit upon, but that I could actually use it as a linear structural drawing element in the finished painting. And the painting I made using that method ended up as the first painting of mine to enter a public collection, which happens to be the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art in 1968. It was bought by a guy named Gerald Nordland. I happened to be telling Gary Garrels about this. He had no idea because, as every museum, exposes a very small percentage of what they own, he hardly knew this painting was in the collection. When I was preparing to do this talk, I wrote him to ask if he could get me a slide of it. Well, I didn't get a response. He, by the way, is one of the first curators of Diao and had been responsible for the very important show of Bryce Martin's Cold Mountain series, and also Bryce Martin's retrospective at MoMA. While in 1950-51, when Newman was making his Via Heroicus Sublimis, he also made this very thin, narrow painting, which he called The Wild. It happens to be about 8 feet tall and about 1.5 inches wide. It's basically on a blue ground with the red down the middle, but showing some of the blue on either side. He did quite a few kind of small, thin paintings like this, and he famously, at a moment when he probably sold less than 5 paintings in his life, asked to have one of them, if he could buy it back from Alfonso Osorio. And his reasoning was the climate did not exist yet when these paintings could be understood in what he meant to say. Well, basically, he was already in that great struggle of all those first generation people as to say, who did the big painting first? And that's a story that's going to run through a lot of this. In any case, in 1965, was working on basically square canvases where I would paint 1/2 of one side of a diagonal, overlap half of it, going around the middle, each time covering half of what was painted. And of course, I use masking tapes to do this. And by the way, I thought as a young, prematurely arrogant artist that I was doing better than Ken Nolan, who had already said famously that he discovered the middle. I said, well, I have the middle, but I have the corners too. But in any case, one of the remnants of the tape I saw as a painting. And so I basically just put it on a thin piece of wood. And here again, my association with the Guggenheim Museum came in helpfully because they had a wood shop. So I was able to rip a piece of wood to exactly the 3/4 width of the tape. And I still have this painting. It was like in the corner. I just dug it out the other day, and there it is, a quick snapshot of it. I'm sorry, the colors, the light is not good. And just to get it out of the way, I would like to show you this work. I think it's directly influenced by Barnett Newman in its use of the entire space, in its not dividing, but still, having to make divisions in order to get the scale. What it is 5 standard sheets of sheetrock, 4 by 8 feet, using the very instruments and the techniques and the materials of building a wall, making an 8 by 20 foot wall to be looked at as a painting. And I guess the notion for me is just, that slippery notion of how one thing can be seen as another. Maybe a distant variation of the duck-rabbit picture. You look at it one way, it's just a dumb wall. You look at it another way, it's like a painting. And the 5 sheets of 4x8 sheetrock, I actually went to 5 different lumber yards, because though they are within a range of industrial neutrality, some batches will be more pinkish, others will be more greenish. So I was able to achieve a kind of difference. And of course, I think the argument in my mind was at that moment when it was about the death of painting. My argument here is with Saul LeWitt, with people like that, minimalism. Other pieces in this show would be a declared area which I would plaster using the tools of plastering to make a very glistening, impacted, honed rectangle of white plaster. And I realized that in 1968-69, I was doing something that is not unlike, say, a Karen Sander. Well, we all hung out at Max's Kansas City beginning around December 65. Around 66, 67, Mickey of Max's Kansas City opened an auxiliary bar across the street. This is Park Avenue South and 18th Street. I took this photo the other day. It was a restaurant that was called 2 names. It was called Broome Street Expressway and Longview Country Club. I happened to have been the relief bartender there, working like Sunday afternoons and so forth. And who would come in but Barnett, Newman, and Larry Poons. And I had the great pleasure of serving them. Because I wanted to put this story into this talk, I went and I phoned Frosty Myers, since he had designed the bar, to ask for an image of the interior, which, by the way, had Marc de Souvreau sculpture. Which had a Marc de Souvreau sculpture and a very large yellow primary structure-like thing by Peter Reginato. Well, Frosty didn't have an image, and I phoned to Peter Reginato, and he didn't have one either. But as I've done in the last month, is everyone I talked to for information, I would try to get their stories about Barney. And I'm sure there are many people in this room, which maybe some of you will be able to share with us later, your own private stories with Barney. Well, the thing that's salient for me in remembering this episode, just quickly, Peter's story was, there was Barney. He was at a party at David Prentice's, who was a painter of my generation who painted only white paintings with a hint of pink or green at the top. And somebody who Ileana Sonnabend was on the verge of promoting, but somehow it didn't happen to pass. Well, anyway, there was David Prentice having a party, and supposedly Barney was there all by himself, and Peter claimed that he went and talked to the old guy. And well, everyone says whenever you talk to him, he has lots to say, and my experience certainly was that. In any case, the reason I wanted to show this restaurant is that he was there with Larry Poons. Now, while doing research at the Newman Foundation, I asked, did Newman respond to strangers, people's inquiry to meet and so forth. Well, we know he was a very, social guy. But in any case, Heidi said there's a note from Larry Prunes that merely said, phone me with the phone number. So I wonder if I was there when they did meet. But in fact, I suspect they had already been meeting for some time, because in the literature you will find that Newman, given his wonderful sartorial makeup and his kind of very conservative, elder statesman look, was asked by Larry Prunes to talk to the guy's father, because the father didn't want the son to give up composing at the Boston Conservatory to be a painter. So Newman said to the father, if you really support your son, you should make sure that he has a warm studio. And moreover, it turns out that through this connection, it's variously stated, but I happen to know that it's Larry's first wife who was the canvas broker, not the father. I forget her name. But through this connection, Newman was able to get 12 feet wide canvas, with which he was able to paint his last two major paintings, Red, Yellow, Blue, number 4, and Anna's Light, which were full 10 feet tall by 20 feet wide. Also, 18th Street, that was just such an amazing, across from Max's Kansas City, because a block away was Don Judd's studio. In the same building, at some point, was David Whitney's gallery. Around the corner was Larry Zox, the painter, who died just recently. So one of the things I guess I want to get across is the sense of community that we had. I mean, it was a much smaller art world, and everyone knew everyone. Maybe not as closely as during the Cedar Bar days, but certainly there's the same trajectory of the watering hole for artists, and the sense that you could just, see somebody in the street and talk for hours, as I did with Ray Parker and Anne Reinhardt on the corner of Houston Street. Well, having first denigrated Newman's work, Tom Hess finally came around, and this is the first monograph on Newman, which was written and printed on the occasion of his first show, his one show at Nerdler in 1969. And very sadly, he died in 1970. And within a year, the Museum of Modern Art had put on a memorial show of his, and Tom Hess, once again, wrote the catalog. And it's a very controversial book because the first earlier monograph was short and to the point, but when given a chance to expand on some theories, Tom Hess went very much into making Newman into the master of the Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism. And Newman was very metaphysically inclined, but he was the furthest thing from being religious in any way. So many people contest this, and one of the most vociferous critic of this line of thought was Tony Smith, who, along with Pollock, remained steadfast to Newman throughout his life. And then the same essay, the same show went to the Tate with this very unusual painting called Uriel on the cover. It's the same scale as Via Heroicus Sublimis, but it had a very unusual kind of pale powdery blue. And it was bought by E.J. Power, Alan Power, A.J. Power. an English collector, probably prompted by Alloway. And at some point, it belonged to Lord Palumbo, the famous collector of architectural gems. Now I think it's in a German collection. It's interesting that Hess wrote 3 books on Newman after first putting him down as, a hack, a fraud. In my library is also this undergraduate thesis by our own Tiffany Bell. I'm happy to show an image of this because I value Tiffany as somebody coeval with myself, living and working in this time. And parenthetically, it's a way of paying homage to Gilbert Roth, the painter, who was her teacher at Princeton at that time. I'm very happy to hear from her that she's writing a big monograph on Agnes Martin, having already done one on Dan Flavin. And she has a connection to Diao. Her husband did the design for many of the spaces. It's a little late, but nevertheless, Harold Rosenberg did write the big Abrams book on Newman. And there's nothing to scoff at, and what's very valuable for me about this particular book, which I see they have on sale outside. Oh, no, you have the Temkin one. This one is probably out of print. Well, it has a wonderful appendix. And I don't even know where to begin to talk about a couple of things, but maybe this is as good a moment as any. Well, Newman, as I said before, did not take anything lying down. If something was not to his liking, if he thought it distorted his thinking and undervalued his work, he went to it. He would respond usually with amazingly succinct but to the point letters. And there's this long, hilarious back and forth letters between Motherwell and Newman. Around, it's fairly late, I think. I can't remember now. I always get the dates mixed up. But in any case, Motherwell always saw himself as the spokesperson for more than he could bite off. And usually it's to make himself look good, one has to say. Now, this view of Motherwell, I have to confess, is something I inherited from Alloway once again. It didn't begin with me. Alloway would say, oh yes, the endless elegies to the Spanish Republic. Well, in any case, Motherwell was asked by somebody named Compton, or someone like that, to talk about the early days, the great early days of abstract expressionism. And Motherwell said, oh yes, in those days, Clifford Still was very close to Rothko, and Newman was very close to Rothko. So obviously, they're all in cahoots together and influenced each other. And Motherwell really went to town on this, explicitly pointing out that how would Motherwell know since he wasn't there in the studio, but moreover that Newman was still alive to speak for himself, whereas Motherwell had said that Walker Bradley Tompkins was a dilettante when asked to write something on Walker Tomlin by the Whitney Museum, and also pointing out that at a moment when no reviewer would review Clifford Still, and Newman asked everyone to sign a letter, Motherwell was the first to refuse to sign. So I don't want to go into it too much. You have to look this up. It went on for like several issues of the Art International, and it is just so funny. Motherwell thought he was very funny in likening how he stupidly slipped the anchor on his boat. And a boat slipped is okay, but a friendship is more valuable, and he didn't want to lose that. And Newman, in the end, said something about it's easy to slip the anchor and at the same time let the cat out of the bag. Just amazing quips that I wish I could, give you the whole story. But in any case, fairly early, Harold Rosenberg wrote a piece for Vogue magazine, of all places, positively about Newman. And Newman actually wrote a very, nice thank you note saying that this was the best piece he'd, written about his work. I hope you realize, that I'm revealing myself to be the kind of, I'm very interested in all this ephemera, if you will. And, it's not easy to approach work directly. And my tendency is to always approach it through the roundabout way, like from footnotes and from appendices. Here is a Pace Gallery book on Newman, penned by Yves Lambois, a wonderful exegesis of one-ment and the logic of how Yves Alain thought Newman came to accept this and to think of it as the foundation moment of his mature work. And actually, I think Yves Alain was touted to be the writer for the Catalogue Raisonné, but in the end, Richard Schiff did it, as he did many books. This is a book you all have to get. It's a 1990 selection of writings and interviews by the man himself. It's in paperback, so I'm sure you can get it. It's just amazing. In it, you will find the very famous argument he had with Erwin Panofsky, the famous art historian. It turns out that Via Heroicus Sublimis was in a magazine in Art News, probably by Tom Hess, I don't remember now. But somehow, in the captions, the word sublimis, which is spelled with an I, was misspelled with a U. And Erwin Panofsky questioned whether this artist was too arrogant to think that he knew enough Latin to use a title called Via Heroicus Sublimis, man, sublime and strong or something. In any case, Newman wrote back and gave Panofsky some lessons in Latin. But mostly what he did is he said, this is really ridiculous, because if he only had read the text, he'd realize the U was just a misprint. But even if it were a U, that could work too in Latin. Would you contest if somebody was writing in Chaucer's time about E.O. Shoppy with two P's? Well, it's not a blatant mistake. It could work as a same word as shop with one P. So it just went on like that. And another very telling piece was a short exchange with Clifford Still's wife. In '65, Maurice Tubman, out in California at the LA County Museum, had mounted a show called The New York School. Now, most people, including Newman, did not like the title. And you can imagine, because most artists do not want to be subsumed by a movement. But in any case, Clifford Still was in the show, and by this time, Clifford Still was not in friendly terms with anybody. He was stuck down in Maryland, making copies of his work, basically. Well, what Clifford Still did, well, first Newman questioned certain paintings in the show as stated to have been shown and done at a certain moment, but in fact were facsimiles, or as he put it, ringers, or copies thereof. So Clifford Still, instead of replying himself, got his wife to write to the Art News to say, oh, Newman is ridiculous because my husband certainly did these paintings. Not only that, but he was a student of my husband's because he had seen them. Well, obviously Newman had to write back and say, it's embarrassing to have to, censor a friend's wife. But unfortunately, I have to because she's not, this stuff is on the table, and goes on to list exactly the differences between what might have been shown in the very famous 15 Americans show of 1952. I'm sorry to bore you maybe with all this chronology, but I think it's important. And as long as I'm at it, that happened to have been a very big bone of contention in Newman's career. The 15 Americans show at the MoMA, at Museum of Modern Art, one of a long series curated by Dorothy Miller. Actually, I have the catalog, and looking at it, half the people in it you wouldn't know, and if you even know their name, they're terrible artists. But it did have Rothko and Clifford Still, the big competition for Newman. And the fact that Newman was not in it was a great hurt to him, even though in the catalog that he owns, which I presume is at the foundation, it's inscribed from Clifford Still, basically saying, you should have been in this show. And the big, well, anyway, I'll let it go at there. This is another Pace catalog, Pace Gallery publication by Jeremy Strick. The essay is devoted to Newman's pre-one-ment work, the drawings and the surreal genetic moment type work. Jeremy Strick is now at the Nasher Museum in Dallas and dealing with sculpture. This next book is from Düsseldorf. It was a show in 1994 that was meant to be a show of Newman's sculptures, which he actually did quite a few very important ones. But then the show grew to include some paintings. And actually, it was only in reading the text in this book by the German historian that I came to realize how painful it was for Newman to have gone through those years of ridicule, basically. That it wasn't just benign neglect, but his colleagues basically actively went on the town to denigrate him and to make him, seem like a hack. And basically, I think he sold very few works. It wasn't until about 58, very late, when Ben Heller happened to have bought a bunch of paintings. Not only did he buy a bunch of paintings, but he also got the Museum of Modern Art, which is to say Alfred Barr and Dorothy Miller, to really look at the work again and to include Newman in the very important show that sent the first generation people to Europe on a big tour from the USIA Information Agency, which was how American painting, really got put on the map. And then subsequently, MoMA bought some work. And Ben Heller is the same collector who ended up buying Pollock's Blue Pose, which subsequently got bought by Australia. But he also bought Via Heroica. He bought Via Heroica Sublimis. And at some point, I don't think he donated it to MoMA, but anyway, it's in the MoMA collection now. This is the Ann Temkin 2002 retrospective, which took place in Philadelphia and then went on to the Tate. I was very lucky. I actually got to see both hangings and even attended a symposium at Philadelphia, which was a multi-day one, but I only managed to attend one day, where they ridiculously had James Turrell, who, I don't think he ever knew Newman, but also had Mel Bachner speak. And the hanging of the Stations of the Cross at Philadelphia was particularly good. It had the benefit of a whole line of skylights, so it was shown under natural lighting. And because I got to see the Tate version to compare it and realize how much better the one under the natural light was. And now there's the Catalogue Raisonné, which was published in 2004. As I said before, I noticed that Richard Schiff, once again, is collared to do the main heavy lifting. And anyway, the Catalogue Raisonné is about this thick. It doesn't fit into any shelf because it's kind of tall. But it's only a quarter the size of Motherwell's Catalogue Raisonné. In any case, earlier on, I had been looking at this particular book by Brenda Richardson on the complete drawings of Barnett Newman for the Baltimore Museum. And in it was a simple chart enumerating under each medium the number of works Newman did under each year. Somehow, looking at it made me think about the convention of being the great artist. Clifford Still certainly wants to be the great artist and is famous for having 7,000 works in his archive, in his stockade, in his storage. One thinks of Picasso, who can't let his arm rest because he's so creative, he has to be working constantly. And here is Barnett Newman, who has meant something to me. And if you count up his works in Brenda's book, he only made 107 paintings. If you average it out, it's probably in his 27-year career, probably 5 paintings a year or something. Anyway, it was so kind of salient in my mind, the discrepancy between the convention and the reality of this person, that I decided to make some work actually based on this chart. So what I did is, actually I began with a smaller one, which didn't work. It, in the end, had to be of a certain scale. It is not the heroic scale of Via Heroica Sublimis, but it is 13 feet. And basically, all I did is to paint the hell out of that space. Once again, mindful of holism, the whole thing, not breaking things up, a la Alloway. And then just reiterating each medium and the 27 years of his life and the number of works next to each year. And I decided to make each category sort of get bigger and bigger. My main point is I didn't want to foreground painting as the most important medium, but in fact made other the biggest column. Other happens to be a synagogue that he did for an architectural competition. And then the yellow zip on the left was his life, 1905 to 1970. And the yellow dates on the right are the years of his career, 1944 to 1970. When I was doing this, it was just, a flat-footed way of another way to make a painting, which is to not think of itself as, space, light, grandeur, or actually, aesthetics, which is something Newman spoke against. He wasn't about beauty. He was about declaring presence in space and being there. What I did not realize until the painting was done is any graphic designer would be able to tell you that you do not put blue on top of a field of red. What it does is it produces simultaneous contrast, it creates a kind of dizziness, and you cannot focus. And at first it was upsetting, and then I said, oh my God, this is a great lucky break, because here I am alluding to Newman, who wrote about the sublime. So sometimes I refer to this painting as my cheap sublime. At the same time, I am not unaware that some other people have already alluded to Newman. Perhaps 5 years before me, at Pat Hearn Gallery, Philip Taft had made a direct to-scale transcription of Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow, Blue, #2. The first painting Newman did completely in acrylic. Well, what he did is he rendered the zips into decorative ribbons. And the title of his work was We Are Not Afraid. And actually, I didn't have a chance to get a slide, but reading the New Art Forum that just came out, there's a review of Kerry James Marshall at the Austrian Secession. And he's made a painting the same size as Via Heroicus Sublimis, but in red, black, and green, the colors of the African liberation. And the title of his work is Who's Afraid of Red, Black, Green? At the same time, in 1990, I made this painting, which basically is every painting Newman made in the 27 years of his life to scale. I was not unaware that Stephen Prina has an ongoing project, which he calls The Exquisite Corpse, after Duchamp, after surrealism, actually, not just Duchamp. But what he did is he had every of the 556 paintings by Manet in scale. And his project would take that particular printout of the 556 paintings in scale and juxtapose it with each painting full scale. So on the left is a brown paper with thin watercolor washes of the scale of the particular painting he's alluding to. I thought that was very interesting work, but at the same time, I also thought it was a great way to have a lot of work for sale. I want to show this because it was an important essay for me. Don Judd had written a piece on Newman in 1964. It didn't get printed until 1970 in Studio International. And basically, the piece he wrote a lot about is this large painting of the same vintage as the Stations of the Cross, but done when Newman's brother died. The painting is called Shining Forth to George. And with amazing economy of means, basically it's just 3 orders of black on raw canvas, 9 by 14 feet. It's now in the Pompidou collection, so you can see it there. You have a thin painted line on the left. You have a thick 3-inch one smack in the middle, possibly the right edge just to the left of center, which is one of the tricks he loved to use. And what's really brilliant is the thin white reserved line where he basically put a piece of tape down on the right and painted over the tape so the paint exceeded the edge of the tape and then took the tape away. What's really amazing is how that reserved white somehow makes you more aware of the white as not somehow recessive, but it just really brings it back up to the surface. And the important thing about this article is Judd says what Newman achieves is not just in terms of mere size, but it is about scale. And that's something that I'm very mindful of. I'm sorry about the lack of cropping of the painting hanging on the cage, but I sort of like the idea that paintings have another life other than in an exhibition. I mean, they have to be in storage. And anyway. So as Yasmi had already said, Diao had 2 shows of Barnett Newman on Worcester Street. It began in 1982, and at some point, one of the paintings left, and there was only 3. Well, it was a great, boon to those of us who live nearby, because, coming home from the food emporium or wherever, one could just pop in and take another, deep breath of these Newmans. On the left, you see that amazing Anna's Light, which was a late painting and the largest painting he ever made. All it is the slab of red, 18 feet wide, with a bit of white and a little bigger piece of white on the right. And what's amazing is you are trying constantly to establish where the painting ends. And it's almost not possible when you're standing close to the middle in front. And just an amazing painting. And then the next one is Moment One. Again, at the time when he was involved in thinking of raw canvas as a color already. And here is just 2 brilliant yellow lines, which happened to have been done in oil. So there was a kind of bleed from into the ground of the canvas. And supposedly he was asked by Betsy Baker if he minded the bleed. And he actually said that he thought it stamped the painting down more firmly because of the bleed. And here I could question him because in a way there's a fetishization of the oil medium because acrylic doesn't do that. And he likened the acrylic linearity to something more like design. And somehow, even with Barnett Newman, when it came to oil, his gaze is more heavenward. The other 2 paintings, I'm not sure from the slide, and my memory doesn't serve me, but I think the one, dark one, is Ulysses, which I think belongs to the Glimchers. And the one on the right is called Now Too. And it's one of the few paintings he did which was put on a very thick stretcher. I noticed it, I thought that's very strange why he would have such a thick stretcher. And then I have to say, well, possibly, influence goes both ways. By this point, he was very aware of Frank Stella's work. And so very possibly the whole question of the painting as an object and so forth had to have been at play. Oh, actually, I do want to say that I want to acknowledge Diao Foundation as a wonderful partner in this community. This is 82, 85. I noticed immediately that the photos were taken by Dan Walworth, who was a student in the Whitney program, which I had a long association with. But what I wanted to say is Diao was a wonderful source of employment for a lot of students. Many of them were inscripted either to be guards or to actually go and have to polish the damn kilometer every year. And then the other thing I almost forgot to say is, the end of this showing of these Newmans would have to coincide with the beginnings of the Lower East Side galleries. And that particular moment when, neo-expressionism was just cusping and something new was about to happen. My first show after many years of inactivity was in 1985 on the Lower East Side. Well, having done the two paintings on Newman, a year or two later, I was invited by a French institution in Dijon to spend 3 or 4 months in a residency. So I thought this was a perfect chance for me to make a suite of paintings referencing Newman. Somehow I liked the 7x13 size for the red painting, but I thought it could be bigger. So very astutely, I decided on the stretchers, the canvas, the paint, and had everything shipped off ready for me to work on during the short compressed time. And that one on the left is basically, not unlike the one you already saw. But this yellow one is every painting Newman did, the title thereof. And I have to say the original inspiration for this piece was very much hearkening back to that old argument as to who did what, where, when, and who saw it. Because Newman actually had that, as a quote somewhere. It's very important that we know who showed what, in which gallery, and when. So here, it tells you exactly the name of the painting he showed under the year it was shown. And then the next one basically is that same idea of every painting in scale stretched to 27 feet, which I actually don't like that much. I think it's too big for the subject. I prefer the smaller one. And then the final one, his life rendered in an elegiac black and white. Now, there's something about beautiful, caressive surfaces that just invite people to want to touch it and even destroy them. I myself had a big black painting destroyed in Vancouver, but Newman even more so. In 87, in Amsterdam, somebody went in and slashed one of my favorite Newmans, which is Red, Yellow, Blue #3, a huge 18-foot painting. Big, the one with big area of red in the middle. The guy went to jail for a few years, but Dutch law being what it was, he was let out, and there's a very sad story of the restoration of that painting. Now, I happen to know from the old days working at the Guggenheim that Newman loved and trusted Orrin Riley, and at some point wouldn't let anyone else touch his paintings. But, of course, by 86, he wasn't around to say anything about it. And very unfortunately, one of the persons they had working on the red painting was Daniel Goldreyer, Madison Avenue conservator. And he very insensitively actually used a roller to put on the red. So I haven't seen the restored result, but I can imagine that it's hardly the painting that those of us, had seen it and loved. And the really sad thing about it is in 1997, the same guy came in to the Stedelijk looking for the red painting, and not finding it, came upon Cathedra, which is certainly one of Newman's most important early paintings, with a just amazing deep, deep blue with a whitish white zip down the middle and a blue line on the left. And he slashed it 7 times and was quickly apprehended, but his claim was he thought he made the painting better. Just really just heartrending. And of course, it's most difficult, as you would know, to restore a painting with very little incident. With an Impressionist painting, you can hide it in the stroke, the slash. But when it's a clean monochrome, it's hard to hide the restoration. And what's interesting is, Ad Reinhardt had written that it's really a tragedy to send a pristine painting out into the world and to have it come back sullied and trashed. But then in his case, he said, and then the thing to do is to keep painting it again until it's pristine again. In his case, he could do it because he was just using thin washes of dark colors. And besides, it's the last painting anyway. But in Newman's case, we've lost 2 amazing paintings. Anyway, the debacle of these destruction was echoed in a lot of scholarly work. This was from a museum journal, which happened to present the 4 paintings of Who's Afraid of Regular Blue in scale. And I have it for obvious reasons because, I like to be able to see those paintings in scale in relationship to each other. This is the last showing of Newman's in New York a couple years ago in a small gallery. I couldn't get an image of the painting in the book called Outcry. The essay again by Schiff. What's important about the painting Outcry is it was the first painting he made after his heart attack, and it predates all the Stations of the Cross, which he had likened to the outcry of Jesus who said, "Why, God, why have you forsaken me?" That he reduced that whole series to that moment of defilement. And in any case, it's very important in my thinking because one of the things that I love about painting is it's never just the color and the shapes on the painting, but it's also everything that it relates to. In this case, the fact that it was his first painting after the heart attack has a certain kind of resonance for me. not unlike the same kind of feeling that one would have to approach, say, Van Gogh's painting of the crows coming out of the cornfields. It's just a painting of a bunch of black specks coming out of yellow. But then when you know it was the last painting he painted before his suicide, so-called suicide, it became something else. Well, anyway, the Catalogue raisonnée compelled me to revisit the subject. And so, because the order of paintings had been increased from about 107 to 120 or so, and when he did which was also re-inscribed. So I was compelled, and happily compelled, to be able to revisit the subject. This painting was shown recently at the Conceptual Abstraction Show at Hunter College. It is the updated revisit of the same subject from 1990. And I was particularly amused because the charge to the artist was to show early work from the period of 1990 and new work. And I was able to skew their notion of linear progress or temporal timing, by showing a painting that looks virtually the same as the painting from 1990, but in fact is done in 2010. If you put the two paintings together, you will see that the blue line on the left was yellow in the other one. Same size, 7 by 13. And as long as I was on the subject, I ended up really back in the subject. In this case, after his first one-ment of 1948, 1949 was his most productive year. It's the 1 year he made 18 paintings. So in this case, it's just the 18 paintings in scale in a field that would maybe, if you think of that whole red field as his 27-year career. The same idea, but just the titles of the paintings. For several years after his heart attack and his total being shattered by his reception, he did no work between 56 and 57. So that allowed me to allude to that story by painting this painting, which I call his gap years. And this one reiterates the two diamond paintings he made with the titles of the paintings. Now, this is a very famous photograph, which was published in Life magazine in 1950. It was on the heels of a group of avant-gardist New York artists complaining about Metropolitan Museum not having any support for contemporary work. And I was amazed. This photograph is ubiquitous, and that's also something I like to make use of, as I did with, say, the Malevich photograph. Is, I'm not out to find arcane something, but I actually want to use like canonical images that everyone knows, and to use it to address something maybe more specific. Well, what I saw in this is the amazing curiosity that despite at that moment when his colleagues were just putting him down for his paintings, they put him in the center of the picture as spokesman for the group. There's Clifford Still, actually, like this. He hadn't gone into his Hermitage yet. Anyway, thinking about this painting brought me to make this painting. Because the 18 Irascibles, there was only one woman, and at that point, people hardly knew if she was even alive. But in fact, shortly thereafter, she re-emerged and had some retrospective show, and and then subsequently died at a very advanced age. Now, I wanted to tell the story of running into Annalee Newman at Books and Company shortly after Ad Reinhardt's big retrospective at MoMA done by Yves. And in fact, the foundation didn't have that many photographs of the two of them together. I mean, other than ones you've seen a dozen times. It was explained to me that Newman never allowed anyone to ever watch him work. And when presented in public, he liked to be wearing a suit and looking like a businessman, and exhorted his fellow artists to do the same whenever appearing in public. Well, in any case, here is a photo of Annalee and Barney in their West Side apartment with 3 Stations of the Cross hanging behind them. It's so in the books that, Annalee's complete devotion to her husband. But in this case, I have met her, but we've never had more than a hello between us. But I was in Books and Company, and Annalee was loudly denouncing the catalog for the Ad Reinhardt show because it showed an image from a very important group of meetings in 1950-51 called the Studio 35, where the artists gathered together to account for, various questions that were on people's minds. Well, it was a very long table, and the photographer basically, the photographer basically took the tables apart and shot the people in one direction, and then turned around and shot the people in the other direction. And because the people in the middle were close to the lens, they would be imaged twice towards the gap. Now here's a picture of Reinhardt staring down with Newman on the right in profile. Here is Reinhardt staring towards the camera, and Newman not visible behind another person. So of course, since it was the monograph for Reinhardt, they picked this view. But that didn't stop Annalee from complaining that her husband got written out of history, Soviet style. So that led me to do this painting, which restored the two views and making the names of who was present as place cards. And we already, it's the same year, 1950, but instead of just one head of stern, we at least have Biala and Louise Bourgeois in addition. And actually, what's interesting now that I think of it is this would be another painting of mine where you could hang it either direction. Well, I'm fascinated with New York as a place, and one of the reasons I think Barney, besides the amazing achievement of his art, is his being the quintessential New Yorker, and since my arrival in 1964, continued attempt to be rooted. And one of the paintings I did around 91 was actually every studio I've ever had since coming here. And what's interesting is, young artists begin with small spaces and then maybe getting bigger spaces, and in the end, ending up with a smaller space, but you make do with you're able to get. But even here, I'm thinking how lucky I am to have arrived in New York in '64, because a young artist beginning to come to New York now would not have the chance. And surely the kind of art they make is going to reflect the studio and the physical surroundings that they have at their hand. Anyway, I'm very, at some point, as an early pioneer of Soho, every lit window in Soho, I knew exactly the name of the artist who lived there. I had plans to make paintings of the map of New York, dotting and locating the studios of everyone I knew by memory, not by research. Well, other people have done that by now, so I don't think I need to do that. But Newman famously had some amazing studios. This was just before he had to leave Front Street, 100 Front Street, which was the first image I showed, because the building was coming down. They're building maybe 55 Water Street or whatever, one of those gigantic buildings. And he is walking past Who is Afraid of Red, Yellow, Blue, number 3. And just rooting around in the archives, I realized that for a while he had a studio on 4th Avenue by 12th Street. And it turns out that in 65, 66, before I moved to my big loft on Canal Street, I had a studio in the earlier iteration of this building, 110. It was 2 old 3-story slope roof buildings that have been destroyed. What's interesting is I was here on the 3rd floor. Right next door to me was the studio of Jack Wesley, who at some point before that, Joe Baer was there. And in the same building was Rudy Burkhardt and also Al Leslie. And they made Pull My Daisy in that building. And it turns out Newman had his studio in the early iteration of that address, 114, which also had Ludwig Sander, a very important artist of the 50s. So, you know, it's amazing that we have this richness. And at the same time, another studio he had was on 19th Street, just opposite his apartment. And as an example of the kind of low estimation of his fellow artists, there is in Jack Torkoff's book a description of Barnett Newman's studio on 19th Street, which was a storefront. Jack Torkoff said, "Oh yes, all I ever see him do is stretch canvas." And at the end of the summer, he had the whole show ready for Betty Parsons. And of course, Jack Torkoff would have to be exactly the kind of artist that Newman was not, because he was so kind of moored by the idea of the painter kind of discovering something on the canvas through multiple corrections and the amazing importance of the brush. And just down the street was de Kooning at 85. Well, in around 67, he lost his Front Street studio and he moved into this building. And in fact, by this time, his career was going well enough that he actually managed to have 3 floors, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th floors. This building happens to be owned by Robert Whitman, the performance artist, and his wife Sylvia Castro Cid. It's quite amazing because this is around the corner from where Heiner lives, Heiner Friedrich, and his daughter Saskia actually took over the second floor at some point. But before that, Mel Bachner had it, and before that, Larry Williams and Sharon, I forget her last name. But in any case, the second floor was this, well, I guess you could call that the piano nobile. It's the higher ceilings and wonderful space. What's interesting is for his big 12-foot wide canvases, which he had gotten through Larry Pooms for his late paintings, it's the first time in his life he did not stretch the canvases on a stretcher. He found or bought linoleum of a certain width that he tacked up on the wall. Now this alludes directly to that old problem that I mentioned before of paintings hitting the stretcher bars and making marks where you don't want them to be. In this case, a raw canvas against the plaster wall with its imperfections would have a rubbing, so to speak, as you paint of the wall. Oh, which, by the way, he took umbrage at some critic who likened his work to who's that guy who does the frottage, the surrealist, or Max Ernst. And he was really angry about that because, he said his work is factually, really factually painted. There's no frottage, no accident. Well, in any case, he put up the linoleum, and the canvas presumably is taped. I can't see, because I can't imagine him putting staples and then having the holes of the staples. And it's peculiar that it's this checkerboard. But then one has to know that Newman, when he was painting, always masked off the area he's working with brown paper, because his whole point was he did not want to be affected by the adjoining color. When he's painting one color, he's just dealing with that one color. So obviously for each painting he would have brown paper. I'm showing this painting just in a way to come back full circle. Sorry. I made this painting on my 50th birthday. And basically, I had an old student painting. I mean, the shapes were, if you can imagine, between Ray Parker and some second generation post-painterly abstraction. Not very good. But somehow that painting survived because I had an aluminum frame for it. And the aluminum frame is a piece of aluminum angle which had been made into a frame. So they had slightly rounded corners. And this was a frame, and this was one of the dividends of working at the Guggenheim, is they're constantly upgrading and reframing. So those of us who worked there was free to take whatever was thrown out in the garbage. Well, I happened to salvage that frame, and that's how the painting stayed forever. So on my birthday, as a 50-year-old, I decided to take the painting off the frame and use the back of the canvas. And basically, it just says half full, half empty. And you can hang it either direction depending on how you felt that day. And the arrow is the usual means by which an artist would point you to the up or down. And for me, it's been, I hope that I didn't run on too long, but I'm sorry I'm so long-winded. But for me, one very happy aspect of doing this talk is I'm actually going to find 2 new paintings to add to my Barnett Newman referenced work. This happens to be the Alan Stone show in 1962, which paired the 2 titans of New York art world at that time, Newman and de Kooning. But of course, it was done in such a way that when you open the book from one side, Newman prefaces it, and if you turn it around, it's de Kooning. And this is the cover of the Stations of the Cross show from 1966. I'm looking at this and I'm saying, oh my God, here is a painting. So basically it's going to be, the surfaces are done, I'm waiting to roll it up and take it to the silkscreen shop to silkscreen the enlarged, it's 100 by 72 inches, 72 by 100. If you see the abraded white spine of the book with its fishes, that's going to be silkscreened down the middle. And the painting, of course, has to be called Spine. So I think we'll end there. Do we have time for questions? Oh my God, it's 9 o'clock.
1 or 2 questions. It's a little late.
Yes, Joan.
David, it's absolutely inspiring and heartening to see you, listen to you talk about Barnett Newman and to feel all the love that you have for this artist. I think you've touched everybody in the room. You asked me to come and think about a really tough question.
Yes, I wanted you all to come and keep me honest.
So as the whole talk, I've been trying to figure out what's the toughest question that I could ask you. And
do you mind talking into this? So you can
not at all. I have to. Okay. So this is a question I've always wondered about in relationship to your work. And that is, how do you think about the relationship between the very formal aspects of your painting and your conceptual approach to their content?
I mean, one of the problems one could say about, say, Judd's text on Newman was it's overly formal, but the formal part is the easy part. It's the reach for meaning that usually is the hardest one. So I'm always bending over backwards to try to insert some more meaning to it. And my way of doing it, I think, is to licentiously reach for connections. If there's any connection and I can use it, I will. And there's no final meaning anyway. The work is something to be put in play. For myself, first of all. No, there's meaning in form. Forms have history. They're not neutral. The fact that it's a square is geometrically equal-sided, but the minute it came historically through various iterations, it grabs on, it has more meaning.
that's what I wanted to
No, I'm really worried about, the dauntingness of trying to talk about somebody as huge as Newman, and fearful that I don't really have that much to add. And No, seriously. I mean, certainly there are very astute art historians who have had wonderful things to say, and my memory is so bad, I would have loved to have reiterated some of them.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, we probably have to stop.
I just want to say your memory is quite good, I think. It's great. I think that's why we all stay.